The chipped formica of the reception desk was cold under my palms. I'd already logged into the system, double-checked the insurance authorizations for the first 3 scheduled patients, and restocked the little plastic tubs of tongue depressors. It was 11:17 p.m. Quiet. Too quiet, even for an urgent care clinic on a Tuesday. Usually even this early, you'd have someone nursing a sprain or a kid with a fever waiting in the lobby. Tonight, nothing. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the low thrum of the HVAC. I really needed this job to work out. $22,000. That's what Sarah's surgery, even with insurance, had left us staring down. I'd taken a cut in hours at the library to be home more, to help with the kids, and now this was the fallback. 12 hours a night, mostly empty waiting rooms, and a fraction of what I used to make, but it was steady. The clinic itself was functional. Built maybe 30 years ago, all beige and muted teal. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else. Something almost floral, like potpourri trying to mask a deeper, more chemical odor. There were 8 exam rooms off the hallway to my right, a small lab in the back, and a basement I hadn't even seen yet. The walls were covered in those generic landscape prints, rolling hills, placid lakes, the kind of thing designed to not offend anyone. I'd noticed a slight flicker in the lights in exam room 3 when I did my initial walkthrough with Vaughn, but he hadn't seemed concerned. "Old building," he'd said with a shrug. "Just report it if it gets worse." Vaughn was efficient, didn't offer much in the way of explanation, just handed me the keycard and a laminated sheet of paper and said, "Read these, they're important." The sheet was tacked to the wall beside the computer. No title, just a list of numbered instructions. I glanced at it now, killing time. 1. If your supervisor gives you a verbal instruction that contradicts the written guidelines, follow the written guidelines. Do not confront, simply comply with what is written. That was odd. A little controlling, maybe. I pictured Vaughn telling me to do something, then remembering he'd contradicted the written rules. He struck me as the type. Still, it seemed harmless enough, just covering their bases. 2. If a coworker doesn't appear for their shift and doesn't call, do not cover their station. Leave it empty and log the absence. Do not attempt to contact them. Okay, that was stranger. A bit paranoid? Like, what if someone just overslept or had a flat tire? But again, not my business. I wasn't here to manage personnel. 3. If the occupancy counter shows more people in the building than are signed in, do not take a head count yourself. Note the discrepancy and contact the supervisor. I looked over at the digital display above the door. 0 people signed in. 0 people in the building according to the counter. So far, so good. 4. Do not stop moving in the east hallway. If you need to review something, step into a room first. The east hallway. That was the one leading to the lab in the basement. Why wouldn't I be allowed to stop? It was probably just a safety thing. Keep the flow going, avoid tripping hazards. 5. If a security recording shows you in a location during a time you were not there, report it immediately. Do not try to account for it or explain it to the responding officer. Now that was unsettling. A security recording showing you somewhere you weren't. That sounded like something out of a bad movie. I quickly dismissed it as overzealous security protocol. They probably had some glitches with their system. 6. If you find any object left in the supply closet for you, a note, a gift, a tool, food, do not touch it. Photograph it, place a marker near it, and report it. Do not read the note. The supply closet? Seriously? Someone leaving me gifts? It felt like someone was playing a joke. Probably Vaughn, testing me. 7. If someone addresses you as if they know you but you do not recognize them, do not confirm or deny how you know them. Treat the interaction as a case of mistaken identity and disengage politely. That was just weird. I could see how that might happen in a busy place, but here, it felt unnecessarily specific. 8. Do not wear any fragrance, perfume, cologne, scented lotion on the premises. Wear only unscented products. Fair enough. Probably a lot of patients with allergies. I always used unscented detergent anyway. Sarah's asthma was bad enough. 9. If the basement door is found unlocked at shift start, lock it without opening it to check inside. Log that it was found unlocked. Do not investigate why. Okay, that one gave me a little pause, the basement. I hadn't even seen the basement, and just lock it? Without checking? It was illogical. Probably just wanting to maintain security. I made a mental note to check the door first thing. 10. If you begin a standard walkthrough round, complete it fully before doing anything else. Do not interrupt a round to answer a call, assist someone, or investigate a sound. Another odd one, a walkthrough round. Vaughn hadn't mentioned that, but I could always ask him in the morning. I finished reading, smoothing the laminate with my hand. It felt cold and strangely abrasive. A little silly, honestly. A list of rules like this felt more like something you'd find at a summer camp. I folded the list and tucked it under the corner of the monitor. Out of sight. It wouldn't affect my shift. I was a practical person. I dealt with facts, not paranoia. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. I glanced at the door, then back at the computer screen. I could feel a prickle at the back of my neck, a slight chill despite the warm air blowing from the vents. I shook my head. It was just the lack of sleep. And the stress. $22,000. I needed to focus. I clicked through the patient files again, rechecking the insurance information. The fluorescent lights flickered again in exam room 3. I didn't mention it to anyone. I was restocking the examination room supplies. Gauze, tongue depressors, those little alcohol wipes that always seemed to dry out before you could blink. It was mindless work, but it was something to do. Something to occupy my hands and my brain, even if only for a few minutes. I liked the smell of the antiseptic in those wipes, sharp and clean. It almost felt productive, like I was actively fighting off something, even if it was just the common cold. Exam room 2 was the worst. The vinyl on the examination table was cracked and peeling. There was a faint, lingering odor of something sickly sweet. Probably someone had been in there with a bad infection. I made a note to tell Vaughn about it in the morning. Maybe he could get maintenance to swap out the table. It was a small thing, but the little things mattered. They made a difference to the patients, and they made a difference to me being surrounded by this. I finished with the alcohol wipes, neatly stacking the little blue packets, then the tongue depressors, arranging them in a fan across the metal tray. I was about to move on to the bandages when Vaughn appeared in the doorway. He hadn't said anything when he'd dropped off the rule sheet earlier. Just a quick read these, Caius, important. He looked tired now, his eyes shadowed even in the bright fluorescent light. "Hey," he said, his voice low, "about that basement door. Forget what the list says. I want you to check it. Now." I blinked. "Check it?" "Yeah. Just go take a look. See if it's secure." I had a weird call a little while ago from the security company. They said something about a sensor glitch down there. Probably nothing, but I'd rather be safe. Ignore the rule about not opening it if it's locked. My hand tightened around the box of bandages, that rule. Number 9. If the basement door is found unlocked at shift start, lock it without opening it to check inside. Do not investigate why. It seemed so specific. So unnecessarily rigid. But Vaughn was my supervisor, and he'd said to check it. He'd said to ignore the list. I probably just overthought things. Vaughn was a sensible guy, a little gruff, but sensible. The security company call probably was nothing. A faulty sensor, a raccoon, something mundane. It wasn't like he was asking me to go wrestle an alligator in the basement. I just needed to open a door, glance inside, and make sure everything was okay. It was a reasonable request. "Okay," I said, trying to sound confident, and set the box of bandages down on the counter. "I'll go check it." The basement door was near the back, past the nurse's station and the storage room. It was a heavy steel door, painted a dull institutional green. It wasn't locked. I could see the bolt hadn't been thrown. I hesitated for a moment, the rule echoing faintly in my mind. Lock it without opening it. But Vaughn's words were louder, more immediate. He'd specifically told me to check. He'd given a reason, however, flimsy. I reached for the handle. Cold metal under my palm. It turned with a slight squeak. I pulled the door open. The smell hit me first, damp earth and something else. Something acrid and stale, like old dust and metal. It wasn't overpowering, but it was definitely there. The basement was dark, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. I flipped the light switch. Nothing. I tried it again. Still nothing. Great, I muttered, already feeling a knot forming in my stomach. I pulled my phone out, switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow concrete staircase leading down. The air was noticeably colder down there, and the smell stronger. I started down the stairs, counting the steps under my feet. 12, 13, 14. Halfway down, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was Sarah. I almost answered, but then I remembered the rule about walkthroughs. Complete it fully before doing anything else. Don't interrupt, don't investigate sounds. I ignored the buzz, forcing myself to focus on the stairs. 15, 16. The beam of my flashlight danced across the concrete walls, revealing nothing but dampness and grime. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a large, unfinished room. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, covered in dust sheets. Old medical equipment lay rusting in the corners. I walked further in, shining the light around. And that's when I saw it. Or rather, didn't see it. A section of the far wall, where the concrete should have been, was gone. Not broken, not crumbled, just gone. Replaced by darkness, an absence of wall, a perfect rectangle of nothing. I stood there for a long moment, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to rationalize it. An optical illusion? A trick of the light? But I knew somehow that it wasn't. Then I remembered Sarah, still trying to reach me. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls. She must be worried. I'd promised to call her back after I'd done a quick check of everything. I'd promised. But I hadn't checked everything. Not really. I hadn't checked the thing on the far wall. I'd ignored the rule, followed Vaughn's instruction, and now I had a gaping hole in the basement and a very worried wife, and a growing sense that I'd made a mistake. A bad one. I was restocking the exam rooms, not the fun part of the job. Mostly, it was just replacing paper sheets on the tables, refilling the little alcohol wipes, making sure there were enough tongue depressors. It was tedious, but it gave me time to think, or more accurately, to worry about Sarah and the kids. Little Leo had been coughing again, and Sarah was convinced it was more than just a cold. She'd been taking him to the pediatrician every other day. Another bill. Always another bill. The clinic was quiet, as usual. Dead quiet. It had been 6 hours since the last patient, a guy with a sprained ankle. Vaughn had popped in and out a couple of times, mostly just to check the security cameras. He didn't say much, just nodded and mumbled something about being careful. I still hadn't figured out what I'd done to make him so watchful. I finished room 3, smoothing the paper on the exam table. It was that slightly slick, textured paper they used, the kind that always made a crinkling sound. I hated that sound. It reminded me of old medical records, of things being hidden and forgotten. I stacked the new white packets neatly next to the dispenser. That's when Vaughn came on the radio. "Caius, you there?" "Yeah, Vaughn. Just finishing up in exam rooms." "Good. Listen, Nessa called out sick. She was supposed to cover the triage station tonight. Said she woke up with a migraine. Can you just cover it for her, just for tonight? It's usually pretty slow after midnight anyway." My stomach tightened. Nessa's station, triage, that was the first point of contact for anyone coming into the clinic. And there was that rule, the one about if someone doesn't show and doesn't call, don't cover their station. Leave it empty. Don't contact them. It felt ridiculous, even as I remembered the precise wording. It was a security thing. Vaughn had said during the training, something about maintaining a clear record of who was supposed to be where. But it felt more than that. Ominous, somehow. I probably just needed sleep. Vaughn was being reasonable. It was one night. Nessa probably just had a bad headache. It wasn't like something terrible would happen if I just covered her station. It was a little overcautious, sure, but I needed the money. Every hour mattered. Vaughn, I think the protocol is if someone doesn't call, we leave the station unmanned? I said, trying to sound casual, like I was just clarifying. There was a pause. A long pause. I could hear static crackling on the radio. "Just cover it, Caius," Vaughn said, his voice flat. "It's just for tonight. I'll sort it out in the morning." I didn't argue. I didn't push it. That rule, that weird, unsettling rule, felt like a barrier, and I wasn't equipped to explain why I couldn't cross it. It wasn't logical. It wasn't reasonable. But I couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring it would be wrong. I walked over to the triage station, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. Nessa's desk was neat, as always. Her computer was off, her pen neatly placed in a holder. I switched on the computer, logged in with my own credentials. The screen flickered to life, displaying the standard patient intake form. Then I noticed it on the security monitor, the one that showed the waiting room. There was a figure, sitting in one of the chairs, a woman. I hadn't seen anyone come in. The front door hadn't opened. I checked the log, nothing. No entry. She was facing the door, her head tilted down, obscuring her face. She was wearing a long, dark coat, even though it wasn't cold outside, and she hadn't moved. Not a twitch, not a blink. She'd been sitting there, perfectly still, for at least 15 minutes. I rewound the recording, played it again. She was there, the same position, the same stillness. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but I could see the back of her head, the curve of her neck, and something else, a glint of silver, like a small metallic object attached to the back of her coat. I zoomed in on the screen, trying to get a better look. The image pixelated, blurred. I tried adjusting the focus, but it didn't help. The woman remained a static, unsettling presence on the screen. I went back to the log again. Nothing. No entry, no sign of anyone coming through the door, no indication that she was even there. I checked the front door sensor. It hadn't been triggered. The door was locked, as it should be. I sat there, staring at the monitor, my throat tight. I'd followed the rule. I'd covered Nessa's station. And now there was someone sitting in the waiting room who shouldn't be there. Someone who hadn't come in through the door. I reached for the radio, my hand trembling slightly. I needed to tell Vaughn. I needed to know what was going on. But then I stopped. What would I even say? That there was a woman in the waiting room who hadn't used the door. That it felt like something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. He'd think I was losing it. He'd tell me to get some sleep. I lowered my hand. Feeling a strange, hollow ache in my chest, I was alone. And I was starting to realize that following the rules wasn't enough. It hadn't protected me. It hadn't explained anything. It had only bought me time. Time to watch, time to wait, and time to wonder what was going to happen next. I copied the relevant portion of the security footage to a flash drive. I didn't know why. I just did. I was restocking the paper towel dispensers in the bathrooms. It was a pointless task, really. People used them sparingly, mostly just to dry their hands after washing, but Vaughn insisted on checking them every shift. He said it was about patient comfort. Patient comfort at 3 a.m., right? It gave me something to do, I guess. Something to focus on besides the static on the security monitors and the way the fluorescent lights hummed, a low, persistent drone that felt like it was settling in my teeth. The women's room was empty. I refilled the dispenser, smoothed the folded towels, then checked the soap, full. I glanced at myself in the mirror, dark circles under my eyes. I hadn't slept properly in days. Between the worry about my wife, Lena, and this job, I was running on fumes. I splashed some water on my face, trying to wake up, and then moved on to the men's room. That's when I noticed it. The occupancy counter. It was a small digital display near the reception desk, linked to the door sensors. It showed four people in the building. That couldn't be right. I was at the desk, and Vaughn was in his office, which I'd seen him enter maybe 15 minutes ago. Yusuf was cleaning in the back, near the supply room. That made 3. I finished the men's room, a quick check of the soap and paper towels, and walked back to the reception desk. I glanced at the counter again. Still 4. I scanned the waiting room, empty. Except for, well, the woman, the one from the security footage. She was still sitting there, unmoving. I counted Yusuf again, just to be sure. He was definitely there, humming quietly as he mopped the floor. Vaughn hadn't come out of his office. 3. The counter said 4. A wave of something cold washed over my ribs. Not fear, exactly. More like a recognition of wrongness. A feeling that the world had tilted slightly off its axis. I remembered the rules, or at least the gist of one. Something about a counter, about not investigating, about contacting Vaughn. I vaguely recalled something about it not being about people, necessarily, about the counter registering presence, and then a line about discrepancies, not trying to resolve them yourself, just reporting. It was ridiculous. Probably just a glitch in the system, a faulty sensor. But the image of the woman sitting perfectly still, replayed in my mind, the unblinking stare, the unsettling stillness, and the fact that the security footage hadn't registered her entry. I didn't want to check again. I didn't want to confirm what the counter was telling me. I picked up the phone and dialed Vaughn's extension. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. "You've reached Vaughn. I'm unavailable to take your call. Leave a message." I hung up and tried again, same result. I took a deep breath and dialed his cell. It rang and rang, finally going to voicemail. "Hey, it's Vaughn. Leave a message." I left a brief message, just stating the occupancy count, the discrepancy, and that I wasn't going to investigate. I sounded flat, detached, like I was reading a report. I waited. I stared at the counter. 4. I stared at the woman, still sitting, still motionless. The silence in the clinic was thick, suffocating. Yusuf's humming stopped. I didn't notice when. Then, a click. A soft, almost imperceptible click. It came from inside Vaughn's office. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't said anything. But the click was there, and then another, and another. A series of clicks, repeating at irregular intervals. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, listening to the clicks. They went on for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. And the counter went back to 3. I didn't look at the woman. I didn't look at Vaughn's office. I didn't look anywhere. I just walked back to the supply closet and started rearranging the bandages, making neat little stacks of gauze and tape. I needed to be doing something. Anything. I kept my back to the waiting room. I kept my back to the office. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. And I knew with equal certainty that the silence wasn't empty, it was waiting, and I'd left something in that silence, something I couldn't retrieve. I spent 20 minutes refilling the sharps containers. It was tedious, honestly. Each room had one, bolted to the wall, and I had to carefully swap the full ones for empty ones, making absolutely sure not to stick myself. I used the little plastic tool they provided, but it still made my palms sweat. It wasn't the needles themselves, really. It was the thought of it. The paperwork if I did get stuck, the worry Lila would have. She'd already been through enough this year. The clinic was quiet, almost eerily so. Just the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional beep from a blood pressure cuff in one of the empty rooms. Yusuf wasn't humming tonight, which was different. Usually he was a constant low-level presence, a sort of sonic wallpaper. I hadn't realized how much I relied on it. It was probably good for him to have a quiet night, though. He worked so hard. I finished the last sharps container in exam room 4 and checked my watch. It was 2:47 a.m. Still a long stretch until 6. I hadn't seen anyone in over an hour. It was the kind of slow that felt wrong. Urgent care wasn't supposed to be this empty at any hour. Even overnight, you usually got someone with a bad cut, a high fever, a twisted ankle. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text from Lila. "Just checking in. How's it going?" I started to type a reply, but then I realized I was standing in the hallway, right outside the radiology room. It was a long, narrow corridor, with the X-ray machine and the darkened viewing room at the end. I hadn't even noticed I'd stopped. I just paused to read the text. And that's when I remembered something. Or rather, a fragment of something I'd read in the orientation manual. Something about movement. About not stopping, something about this hallway specifically. It wasn't a clear rule, not like the one about the occupancy count. It was more of a warning. A note, a footnote maybe, something about how the building responded to stillness, about needing to keep moving, about stepping into a room if you needed to look at something, not just stopping in the middle of the hall. It felt hazy, uncertain, like a dream I'd almost forgotten. Honestly, it was probably just some overzealous safety regulation. A way to keep people from blocking the hallway in an emergency. I was probably just tired, letting my imagination get the better of me. It had been a long week, and I hadn't been sleeping well. I'd been so focused on keeping everything afloat, on making sure Lila had everything she needed, on the bills, on the kids, that I hadn't taken a moment to breathe. This place was just getting to me. I was reading too much into things. I finished typing my reply to Lila, slow but steady, "Miss you," and took a step forward. But as I did, I noticed the lights at the far end of the hallway. They were flickering, not all at once, but one by one. The first one went out with a soft pop, then the next, and the next. Each light extinguished itself in a slow, deliberate sequence, moving closer and closer to the viewing room. I stopped again. My thumb hovered over the send button on my phone. I watched the lights die. It wasn't a power surge, it wasn't a blown fuse, it was intentional. The way they went out in that order was too precise, too methodical. I glanced at the radiology room. The door was closed, as always. I could hear nothing from inside. But the darkness was spreading. The hallway was growing longer, narrower. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a tightness in my chest. Not exactly fear, but unease, profound unease. I remembered the fragment of the rule again, clearer this time. Don't stop. Keep moving. Step into a room. This was the hallway. I was stopping. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and started walking, quickly now, towards the nurse's station. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I just kept walking, trying to ignore the growing darkness behind me, the feeling that something was watching me from the radiology room. I needed coffee. I needed to check the log. I needed to occupy myself with something, anything, that would make this feel normal again. When I reached the nurse's station, I didn't sit down. I didn't even pause. I grabbed a fresh cup of coffee and started flipping through the patient charts, forcing myself to focus on the neat handwriting and the medical jargon. I didn't look down the hallway, not once. I kept my back to the darkness, to whatever was extinguishing the lights, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I would be avoiding that hallway for the rest of my shift, and that it would be avoiding me. The coffee tasted like ash. I was restocking the magazine rack. It was a pointless task, really. Nobody ever read those things. They were mostly outdated issues of People and National Geographic that some vendor had foisted on us. But Vaughn had specifically asked me to tidy it up, said it made the waiting room look less depressing. He'd said it with a little too much emphasis on the less, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. The magazines themselves were sticky. Someone had gotten something sugary on the cover of the latest Better Homes and Gardens, and it was attracting a fine layer of dust. I wiped it down with a disinfectant wipe, then carefully arranged the covers, trying to make them look appealing. It was hard to care. My brain was still stuck on the lights. And Nessa, she hadn't called in sick or anything, just hadn't shown up. Vaughn had brushed it off, said she was probably just hungover. But Nessa wasn't like that. She was meticulous, reliable. I moved on to the outdated travel magazines, flattening a crumpled corner. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of the HVAC system seemed louder than usual, and the faint scent of disinfectant was almost overpowering. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:17 a.m. Still another 5 hours to go. I wondered if Lila was asleep. I'd sent her a picture of Leo building a tower out of blocks earlier. She'd replied with a string of heart emojis that had been nice. Vaughn's voice crackled over the intercom. "Caius, we've had a complaint. Mrs. Henderson in room 3 says her call button isn't working. Can you check it?" I sighed. Mrs. Henderson was a chronic complainer. She'd called 3 times already about the temperature in the room. "On it," I said into the intercom. I walked down the hallway towards room 3, passing the radiology room. The lights were all on, thankfully. Everything seemed normal, which after the last few hours felt like a victory. As I approached room 3, I remembered the complaint from earlier. A security breach, a tripped alarm. Something about someone wandering into the restricted zone near the storage rooms. Vaughn had dismissed it as a false alarm, said it was probably just a sensor malfunction. But he'd asked me to pull the security footage from camera 6, the one that covered that area, and review it, just to be sure. I checked Mrs. Henderson's call button. It was working fine. She just wanted attention. I told her so, politely, and she huffed and told me I didn't understand the needs of elderly patients. I mumbled an apology and hurried back to the nurse's station. I needed to get that footage reviewed. I logged into the security system, found the relevant camera, and selected the time frame. The footage started playing. It showed the hallway outside the storage rooms, mostly empty. Then, around 2 a.m., a figure appeared. It was me. I blinked, rewound the footage, played it again. There I was walking down the hallway at 2 a.m., wearing the same clothes I was wearing now, but I hadn't been anywhere near that hallway at 2 a.m. I'd been asleep at home, in bed with Lila. My stomach clenched. I told myself it had to be a mistake, a glitch in the system, a recording error. Maybe the timestamp was wrong. Maybe it was another employee who looked like me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The figure in the footage was undeniably me. I remembered something then. A phrase, a warning, from the orientation manual. Something about recordings, about discrepancies, about reporting it. It wasn't a clear rule, like the occupancy counter, more of a cautionary note. Something about if a recording showed you somewhere you hadn't been, you had to report it. Immediately, don't try to explain it. Don't try to account for it. Just report it. It was probably nothing, a technical issue, a weird coincidence. I could just ignore it. Pretend I hadn't seen anything, but the image of myself walking down that hallway at a time when I was demonstrably somewhere else was unsettling. Then I smelled it, a faint, metallic odor like old pennies. It wasn't strong, but it was definitely there. It seemed to be coming from the hallway, from the radiology room. The smell wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hadn't noticed it before. I hadn't even considered there could be a smell. I grabbed the phone and dialed Vaughn's extension. I needed to tell him. I needed to get this sorted out. I needed to explain it, to understand it. But as I raised the phone to my ear, I remembered the instruction. Don't try to explain it, just report it. I hung up the phone. I found the direct line to security and began to dial. I hadn't even watched the whole recording. I didn't know what else it showed, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I pressed the button to connect. I'm going to need a new notebook. The one I had is missing. I don't remember putting it anywhere. And I need to ask Vaughn about the security system, and maybe about Nessa, but mostly I need to remember to stay away from hallway C, and I need to learn to trust my nose. That smell, I don't think I'll ever forget that smell. I finished the report for security, a short typed account of the footage. I didn't mention the smell. It felt ridiculous to include, like I was adding details to make it sound more dramatic. They'd probably just think I was working too many shifts. I saved the report, printed a copy for my file, and then started going through the medication logs. It was a tedious job, checking expiration dates and making sure everything was accounted for. Lila had been asking about her asthma inhaler again. She said it felt like it wasn't working as well. It was probably just anxiety, the doctor said, but I wanted to be sure we had a fresh one on hand. The overhead lights hummed, a low, persistent drone. I tried to focus on the labels, the dates, the tiny printed numbers, anything to distract myself. The image of myself in the hallway kept flickering at the edge of my vision. It wasn't the act of being on camera that bothered me. It was the wrongness of it. I hadn't been there. I'd been home. I'd felt Lila breathing next to me. I stretched, trying to work out a kink in my lower back. These chairs were designed for short-term use, not 8-hour stretches. I glanced at the break room door, thinking about coffee. Maybe that would help. I could hear the faint chug of the ice machine, the quiet whir of the refrigerator. Normal sounds. Reassuring sounds. It was probably just a glitch in the system. A momentary lapse in the recording. A digital ghost. That's when I saw it. In front of my locker, tucked between the metal frame and the wall. It was small, maybe 1 inch long, a tiny plastic dinosaur, a bright, almost garish shade of green. A stegosaurus. My breath hitched. It was one of Leo's. He'd collected them, hundreds of them, scattered throughout the house. Lila was constantly tripping over them. He'd lost this one about a month ago. He was devastated. He'd searched everywhere. I remembered him crying, convinced it was gone forever. I stared at it. It was impossible. How could it be here? I hadn't brought any of his dinosaurs with me. I hadn't even thought about his dinosaurs. This place wasn't exactly a prehistoric dig site. It was probably someone playing a joke. Ilse, maybe. She had a strange sense of humor. Or maybe one of the kids from the day shift had left it behind. A lost toy. A coincidence. But it was his. I knew it instantly. The tiny chipped tooth, the slightly faded paint on the plates. He'd spent hours meticulously painting those plates. I picked up my phone, intending to take a picture, to document it, to have proof it was just a harmless little toy. Then I remembered the orientation, the manual. Something about objects, not lost and found, something different. A passage I hadn't paid much attention to, something about if something was left for you, a specific placement, don't touch it, photograph it, report it, don't read anything attached to it, don't move it. It felt like a ridiculous precaution, overly cautious, paranoid even. But the memory was insistent, a cold weight in my chest. I lowered my phone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. Just a toy. A lost toy. It meant nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it did, that it was meant to be here, meant for me to find it. I grabbed my phone and took a picture, several pictures from different angles. I made sure the date and time were visible in the metadata. Then I stepped back, carefully avoiding any contact with the locker or the dinosaur. I needed to report this immediately. I tried to call Vaughn, no answer. I tried security, no answer. The line just rang and rang. I checked the clock. It was 3:17 a.m. Everyone seemed to have disappeared. I needed to focus on the medication logs. I needed to get through this shift. I needed to make sure Lila had her inhaler. I needed to get home. I turned back to the logs, forcing myself to concentrate. But I couldn't. My eyes kept drifting back to the locker, to the tiny green dinosaur. It seemed to glow in the dim light. Then I remembered something else. Something about the rule. About what happened after you reported it, after you documented it. It wasn't about what you did with the object. It was about what you couldn't do around it while it was there. You had to maintain distance, avoid the area, stop your work. I looked at the medication logs. They were stacked neatly on the counter, right next to my locker. I needed to finish checking them. Lila's inhaler was in that stack. I needed to find it, to confirm the expiration date, to make sure she had it. But I couldn't. Not now. Not with the dinosaur there. I closed the medication log, pushing it away from me. Lila would have to wait. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk whatever it was. I sat back down, staring at the blank computer screen. The hum of the lights felt louder now, more insistent, more menacing. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I'll check it again when I relieve, Ilse. If it's still there, if she hasn't touched it, I need to know. Lila needs her inhaler, but I don't think I can go near that locker until someone tells me it's safe. I don't think I can. I was restocking the supply closet. Not the big one in the back, but the small one near the entrance. Bandages, tongue depressors, those little paper cups for, well, you know. It was mindless work, alphabetizing things, checking expiration dates. It gave me time to think, but not too much time. Enough to replay the argument with Bethany about the medical bills, but not enough to spiral. Enough to remember I needed to pick up milk on the way home, but not enough to dwell on how long it had been since I'd actually slept. The closet smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust. The kind of dust that clings to everything, even after you've wiped it down. It was cold in there, too. The vent seemed to be blocked, and the air barely circulated. I pulled out a box of alcohol swabs, noticing the cardboard was slightly damp, probably from the humidity. This building was old, always creaking and settling. It was probably just the building. I straightened the boxes, making sure everything was neatly aligned. It was a completely pointless exercise, really. Nobody ever looked at this closet except me, but it gave me something to do, something to control. The front door chimed, signaling a new arrival. I glanced up, expecting Ilse to be back from her break. Instead, it was a man I'd never seen before. He was wearing a dark blue jacket and jeans, and he had a neatly trimmed beard. He looked familiar, not like I knew him, but like I should. It was a strange feeling. He walked up to the desk, and before I could even say hello, he smiled and said, "Caius, good to see you again. Long time no see." My jaw tightened. I don't think we've met." He chuckled, a warm, friendly sound. "Oh, come on now. Don't be like that. We ran into each other at the conference last year. Remember? The medical administration one in Albany? You were presenting that paper on patient intake forms?" I stared at him. Albany. I hadn't been to a conference in Albany. I hadn't presented any papers. Bethany had practically begged me to take a weekend off for a friend's wedding last year, and I'd ended up spending it catching up on sleep and doing laundry. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I really don't recall. I haven't been to Albany in years." He just smiled wider. "Oh, well, maybe I've got you confused with someone else. Happens all the time. You just have one of those faces." He paused, then added, "Still, good to see you're keeping busy." I forced a smile back, trying to appear polite. It was probably just a coincidence, a case of mistaken identity. People looked alike all the time. Maybe he was thinking of someone else entirely. "You too," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Can I help you with something?" "Just a quick question," he said. "I'm looking for Dr. Lawson. Is she in?" "She's with a patient," I said, flipping through the appointment schedule. "It should be about 15 minutes. "Perfect," he said. He didn't seem particularly concerned. He just stood there, smiling. It felt wrong. Too friendly. Too knowing. Suddenly, I remembered something. Something I'd read in the orientation manual. Something about people who claim to know you. About not confirming or denying anything. About disengaging politely. It wasn't about being rude. It was about, I couldn't quite remember the exact wording. Something about preventing a validation, a connection. It felt flimsy, irrational. Just another one of Vaughn's bizarre rules, probably meant to discourage employees from chatting with patients. But right now, it felt important. "She'll be with you shortly," I repeated, turning back to the computer. I refused to meet his eyes. I focused on the glowing screen, pretending to input data. I needed to end this conversation. "All right," he said, his voice still unnaturally cheerful. "I'll just wait over there." I didn't respond. I just kept typing, my fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard. I glanced up briefly, and he was walking toward the waiting area, still smiling, but something was different. His reflection in the glass of the entrance door wasn't right. It wasn't a distortion, not exactly. It was off. The angle was wrong. His head was tilted at an impossible angle, and for a split second I thought I saw a flicker of something else in the reflection, something dark and shapeless lurking behind him. I blinked, and the reflection was normal again. He was just standing there, looking perfectly ordinary. I told myself it was fatigue, that the fluorescent lights were playing tricks on my eyes, that I was letting everything get to me. I needed to finish restocking the closet. I needed to get back to work. I needed to pretend everything was normal. But as I turned back to the supplies, I noticed something else. The dinosaur. Leo's dinosaur. It wasn't in my locker anymore. It was on the top shelf of the supply closet, nestled between the boxes of gauze and antiseptic wipes. It was staring at me. And the cold in the closet felt a lot colder now. It wasn't the vent. It was something else. Something that had settled into the air. Something that felt deliberately placed. I had to get out of there. I had to get Ilse back. Even if it meant going against protocol. Even if it meant risking whatever was happening. I needed another pair of eyes. I needed someone who could tell me if I was losing my mind. I needed to make sure my daughter was okay. And I had a horrible feeling that waiting even a minute longer would be a mistake. I was refacing the magazine rack. It was a pointless task. Honestly, the magazines were always a mess by 8 p.m., and I'd spend the last few hours of my shift straightening them, only to have it undone again in minutes. But Vaughn had asked me to, and arguing felt unwise. He hadn't explicitly ordered me, not in those words, but the way he phrased it, the slight tilt of his head, the way he didn't quite meet my eyes, it was enough. I smoothed out the cover of Modern Home, then adjusted People. It was a surprisingly calming act, the neatening. The clinic was mostly quiet. Old man Tiber, a regular who insisted on being called Mr. Tiber even though his insurance card said otherwise, had been in earlier with a cough, but he'd left hours ago. The hum of the ventilation system was the loudest thing, a constant white noise that usually faded into the background. I even managed to savor the lukewarm coffee I'd brewed earlier. It wasn't great coffee, but it was hot, and caffeine was a necessity. It felt, for a few minutes, like a normal Tuesday night. Then I caught a whiff of it. It wasn't strong, not initially, just a fleeting floral scent, something vaguely sweet. Lilac, maybe? I frowned. My wife Ilse had a lilac-scented hand lotion she used sometimes, but I hadn't been near her all day. I hadn't even hugged the kids properly when I left for work, too focused on the bills and the worry and the sheer exhaustion, and I definitely hadn't put on any cologne. I hadn't worn cologne in years. I shook my head, dismissing it, probably just lingering cleaning product. Norma, the daytime receptionist, used some overly perfumed stuff. It could have just clung to the air vents. I finished with the magazine rack and started to wipe down the reception desk with a disinfectant wipe. The scent hadn't returned. But as I moved towards the triage station to restock the tongue depressors, it came back. Stronger this time. It hung in the air, thick and cloying. And then I remembered. This morning, rushing to get ready, I'd grabbed the wrong unscented lotion. I'd absent-mindedly put on Ilse's, the lilac one. I'd noticed the scent when I got to work, but dismissed it as a pleasant change, a small comfort. Now, though, it felt like a mistake. A glaring one. I remembered something. A fragment of a warning from the orientation packet. Something about scents, something about marking. It wasn't a clear memory, more like a blurred image on a faded photograph. It had something to do with how long a fragrance lasted, how it clung to things, and something about being followed. I stopped dead, halfway to the triage station. The floral scent seemed to swirl around me, intensifying. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced around, scanning the empty waiting room, the hallway leading to the exam rooms. Nothing. But the feeling persisted. I backed away slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for the panic button under the counter. But I didn't press it. Not yet. That felt excessive, and what would I even say? I smell lilac? Vaughn would laugh. Or worse. I needed to get away from the scent. To dilute it. To neutralize it. Without thinking, I turned and walked quickly towards the hallway leading to the staff lounge and the break room. It was the furthest point from the entrance, the most isolated part of the clinic. I told myself I was going to get more disinfectant wipes to try and scrub away the scent from the reception desk. It was a lie, but it felt necessary to have a reason, a plausible explanation. The hallway felt colder than usual, the air stagnant. I walked quickly, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. As I neared the break room, the scent seemed to follow me, clinging to my clothes, filling my nostrils. It wasn't just the lotion anymore. It was something else, something sharper, more metallic, mixed with the lilac. I reached the break room door and hesitated. I didn't need wipes. This wasn't about cleaning. This was about escaping, about putting distance between myself and whatever was happening. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, then immediately regretted it. The break room was empty, but the scent was overwhelming. It saturated the air, clinging to the chipped formica table, the stained coffee maker, the faded linoleum floor. And then I noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air, like heat rising off asphalt. It wasn't visible directly, but I could sense it, a distortion in the periphery of my vision. I hadn't needed the disinfectant wipes. I needed to get out, to get back to the reception desk, to do something. But I didn't know what. All I knew was that lingering here, breathing in that scent, felt profoundly wrong. I turned and walked back towards the hallway, my pace quickening. The shimmer seemed to follow me, growing more pronounced with each step. It wasn't chasing me, not exactly. It was accompanying me, observing me. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it had been there all along, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for the scent, waiting for me to mark my path. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just kept walking, trying to breathe, trying to think, trying to remember everything I'd read in that orientation packet, trying to understand what I'd done, and failing. I was restocking the sharps containers. It was therapeutic in a way. The precise click of the lid, the weight of the plastic, the methodical arrangement on the shelf. Something concrete to focus on after everything else. After the scent, after the man who claimed to know me, after everything. It wasn't exactly calming, but it was a task. Something I could do. The clinic was quiet, predictably. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional gurgle from the aquarium in the waiting room. Old man Tiber, the betta fish, didn't seem bothered by any of this. He just kept swimming in circles, oblivious. Sometimes I envied him. I finished with the sharps and moved on to the exam room supplies. Gauze, bandages, tongue depressors, the little paper cups for, well, everything. Routine stuff. The kind of things you don't even really notice until you're out of them. I had to check the expiration dates on the sterile saline, making sure nothing was past its prime. Lena was meticulous about that, and I didn't want to get chewed out when she came in tomorrow morning. That's when I saw it, the basement door. It was slightly ajar, maybe an inch, which was not right. I always made sure it was locked up tight at the start of my shift. It wasn't a high-security door, just a solid wood door with a simple deadbolt, but it was supposed to be locked. The basement was mostly storage, old files, outdated equipment, boxes of who knows what. It wasn't a place anyone needed to get into, especially not during the night. A little voice in the back of my head said maybe Vaughn had gone down there for something. Maybe he'd forgotten to lock it. He'd been off, lately the instructions that didn't make sense, pushing me to do things that went against everything we'd been trained for. It was probably just him being absent-minded. He was probably just Vaughn. But then I remembered the orientation packet. The section on security procedures, it was buried somewhere. I remembered flipping through it during training. A thin, manila-colored document crammed with warnings and regulations. Something about the basement specifically. Something about finding it unlocked. It wasn't a clear memory, just a fragment, a feeling of unease. Something about not opening it, not even to check, just lock it and log it. That was the gist of it, I thought. Log that you found it unlocked. Don't investigate, don't go inside. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap in the doorframe. It wasn't a big gap, but it was enough to see a sliver of darkness, enough to make my skin crawl. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Vaughn really had just forgotten. A quick peek wouldn't hurt, right? Just to make sure everything was okay. No. The feeling was too strong. The memory, though hazy, was insistent, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that I'd been getting all night. I remembered the recording discrepancy, seeing myself on the security footage in a place I hadn't been. Leo's dinosaur sitting on my locker, the man who knew my name, the scent. Everything felt connected, a tightening knot of wrongness. I didn't need to open the door. I just needed to lock it. I walked over to the door, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. It felt cold under my fingers. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It was just a door, just a basement, just another weird thing happening in a string of weird things. I threw the bolt. The click echoed in the silent hallway. I found a small notepad and pen in my pocket and scribbled a quick note. Basement door found unlocked at 0217. Secured. I taped it to the door frame, right next to the light switch. As I stepped away, I could have sworn I heard a faint scratching sound coming from inside the basement. It was barely audible, a subtle rasping against wood. I paused, listening intently. Nothing, just the hum of the lights, the gurgle of the aquarium, the blood rushing in my ears. I told myself it was probably just the building settling. Old buildings made noises. This place was definitely old, but the scratching, real or imagined, had set something loose inside me, a deep, primal anxiety. I went back to the reception desk and sat down, staring at the security monitors. They showed empty hallways, darkened exam rooms, the flickering blue light of the aquarium. Everything looked normal, too normal. I flipped through the logbook, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. A similar incident, a warning from a previous employee, a note about the basement. Nothing. Just pages of routine entries, patient names, arrival times, chief complaints. I kept replaying the fragment of the rule in my head. Lock it. Don't open. Don't investigate. It felt less like a safety precaution and more like a containment protocol. Like something was supposed to stay in the basement. I glanced at the clock. 02:28. I still had almost 6 hours left of my shift. 6 hours to sit here and listen. 6 hours to wait for whatever had been locked in the basement to start trying to get out. I turned up the volume on the radio, hoping to drown out the silence. A static-filled country song crackled through the speakers. It didn't help. I could still hear it. Not the scratching, not exactly. Something else. A subtle shift in the air pressure, a feeling of anticipation. I pulled my notebook out of my pocket and opened it to a blank page. I didn't start writing a story. I just stared at the empty lines, the pen hovering above the paper. I didn't know what to write. I didn't know what to do. I just knew that something had changed, something fundamental, and I had a feeling that the night was only just beginning. I was restocking the trauma kits. It was a mindless task, thankfully. Gauze, bandages, antiseptic wipes, the little saline pods for flushing wounds. Each kit had to have exactly the same arrangement of supplies. It was a pointless exercise, really. Half the time, whoever ended up using the kit would just rummage through it, tossing things aside until they found what they needed. But Vaughn was insistent. Standardization, he'd said, his voice flat. Reduces response time. I doubted it. It just gave me something to do. The kits were stored in a small alcove just off the main hallway, near the nurse's station. It was colder there, the air conditioning vent blasting directly into the space. I pulled a kit off the shelf, checked the expiration dates on everything inside, and replaced a roll of tape. My fingers were stiff, even through the thin latex gloves. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, a high-pitched whine that seemed to burrow into my skull. It was always something. The lights, the hum, the constant low-level ache in my lower back. I glanced at the clock. 3:17, still a long way to go. I thought about Lena. She was supposed to pick up Leo and Maisie from my mom's in the morning. I hoped she remembered. Lena was good, reliable, but she had a lot on her plate with her own kids and her job at the diner. I made a mental note to text her a reminder, after I finished the kits, of course, priorities. Vaughn had implemented these routine security checks, essentially walking the entire perimeter of the clinic every 2 hours. He hadn't explained why. Something about increased vigilance. It felt like busy work designed to keep us occupied, and I suspected to justify his presence. It was also a little unnerving. This place rarely got busy overnight. Most nights it was just me and Vaughn, and the occasional ambulance dropping off a patient. I finished the last kit and was about to head back to the desk when the radio crackled to life. Caius, you there? It was Vaughn. Yeah, I'm here, I said, adjusting the volume. Start your perimeter check, now. His tone was clipped, bordering on abrupt. I sighed inwardly. I'd just finished restocking the kits, and I had barely started my coffee. But arguing with Vaughn was pointless. He'd just reiterate something about following protocol. I grabbed my flashlight and started my walk. I began with the main hallway, checking each exam room, making sure the doors were secure. Then I moved to the waiting area, scanning the empty chairs, the dusty magazines. Everything seemed normal, too normal. The scent of disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a sterile, almost metallic odor. I tried to ignore the faint, lingering sweetness of the lilac lotion. It had been hours, but it still seemed to cling to me, a subtle reminder of my stupidity. As I reached the end of the hallway, nearing the entrance to the lab, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my wife, Sarah. "How's it going? Any strange occurrences?" I almost stopped to reply. Just a quick all quiet would suffice. But then I remembered something, a vague impression of a rule, something about completing a task once started. Don't interrupt, finish the round. My mind felt sluggish, like trying to recall a dream. It wasn't a clear directive, just a nagging feeling that I shouldn't break the sequence. I dismissed it. It was just Sarah being anxious and me being tired. Probably a leftover from all the ridiculous instructions Vaughn kept throwing at me. I could answer her text in a minute. I was almost to the lab door. But just as I was about to reach for the handle, a sound stopped me. It wasn't loud, just a subtle shift in the air, a scrape, like something dragging across the floor. It came from the hallway I had already checked, the one leading back towards the reception desk. I froze, listening intently. Silence. I told myself it was the building settling, the pipes expanding and contracting. Old houses did that. Old clinics too, I supposed. But the sound had been specific, deliberate. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and started walking back the way I came. The fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. As I neared the alcove with the trauma kits, I saw it. Leo's dinosaur. The little plastic triceratops. It was lying on the floor, right in the middle of the hallway. I hadn't seen it there before. I hadn't even brought it with me. I distinctly remembered putting it in Leo's backpack this morning. And then I noticed something else. The door to exam room 3, the one I had checked just minutes ago, was slightly ajar. When I'd passed it before, I distinctly remembered pushing it closed. I pushed it open now. The room was empty. But on the stainless steel examination table, neatly folded, was one of Sarah's scarves, a silk scarf she wore only on special occasions. The one with the tiny embroidered flowers. The scent of lilac was almost overwhelming. I didn't need to think. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the sound I'd heard wasn't the building settling, and it wasn't my imagination, and I knew, somehow, that completing that perimeter check had become a lot more complicated than I thought. I backed slowly out of the room, my hand reaching for the radio. I had to tell Vaughn. I had to tell someone, but what could I even say? The drive home was blurry. Not because of the rain, though it was coming down in sheets, but because I kept checking the rearview mirror. Not for cars, but for something else. I told myself it was exhaustion, just the adrenaline finally wearing off. It had to be. I hadn't even realized how tense I was until I sat down, until my shoulders finally dropped. Sarah was asleep when I got in. The TV murmured some late-night talk show. I didn't bother turning it off. I just stood there in the doorway of the living room, watching her sleep. She looked so small, so vulnerable. The surgery had taken a lot out of her, and the bills were a weight I didn't know how much longer I could carry. I'd called out, of course, told Vaughn I wasn't coming back. He didn't argue, just a flat all right, and then silence. I almost expected him to try and convince me to stay, to offer more money, but he didn't. It was unsettlingly easy. I made coffee, black, and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The rain reflected the streetlights, turning everything into shimmering streaks of color. I tried to piece together everything that had happened to find some logical explanation. It had to be stress, right? A combination of sleep deprivation and anxiety. That dinosaur, the scarf, the man who knew my name, all just coincidences. My mind was playing tricks on me. I'd been working too hard. But then I remembered the scent. The lilac. It wasn't just on the scarf, it was everywhere, lingering in the air, clinging to my clothes. I'd showered when I got home, scrubbed myself raw, but the scent was still there, faint but persistent. It wasn't the lotion, not exactly. It was sharper, more concentrated, like the oil from the flower itself. I shook my head. It was ridiculous. I was fixating. Leo woke up before school. He was unusually quiet. He didn't ask about my night. He just ate his cereal and stared out the window. He usually bombarded me with questions about his dinosaur collection. I noticed he hadn't brought the Triceratops to breakfast. I asked him about it. He shrugged. It's under my bed. He didn't seem bothered by it being missing all night. I walked him to the bus stop. As we stood there, waiting for the yellow bus to lumber into view, I started checking the numbers on the houses across the street. Not consciously, just glancing, counting, rearranging them in my head. It was a compulsion I hadn't felt before. It felt important. I dropped Sarah off at her physical therapy appointment after work. She's making progress, slowly, but it's grueling. I used to drive her directly to the clinic, park in the lot, walk her to the door. Now I circle the block twice before I can bring myself to park. I have to drive past the park, past the library, past Mrs. Henderson's house with the perfectly manicured lawn, anywhere but directly in front of the clinic. It's not fear exactly. It's a recalibration. A small, insistent adjustment. The parking lot is fine, objectively, perfectly normal. But the light hits it just wrong, and the angle of the building feels off, and there's always a faint, almost imperceptible scent. Not lilac, something else, something metallic. I don't even register it as unpleasant anymore, just present. I park 2 streets over now and walk. It adds 15 minutes to the drop-off, but it's a 15 minutes I need. It's a 15 minutes I'll always need, I think, even when or if I forget why. The ad for the overnight receptionist position is still up on the clinic website. I checked yesterday. It's been there for 1 week. Someone will take it. Someone always does.